In the United States, there are well over 20,000 murders every year, and over 40% of those are never solved and they end up going cold. Basically, what that means is that whoever was responsible for taking that person's life was never caught. Since 1965, there have been well over 340,000 cases of homicide that went unsolved. And today we're diving into 3 of those cold cases with very strange twists. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also deep breathing exercises. Remember to breathe in through both nostrils, not just one. Inhale, exhale. Breathe in that good prana and just let go. But anyway, it's time to dive into some very weird cases that make me really question what happened. The Keddie Cabin Murders. This particular case is all over the place with information, so I'm going to do my best to give you a clear and concise understanding of what may have happened. Bear with me in this case, because there is so much going on. This story starts on April 11th of 1981 and involves a family called the Sharps. We're going to start with the mother, Glenn Susan, or Sue Sharp. She was 36 years old at the time, and at some point in time, several years prior, she met a man by the name of James Sharp. Together, they would end up getting married and having 5 children. The first was 15-year-old John, the second was 14-year-old Sheila, the third was 12-year-old Tina, the fourth was 9 to 10-year-old Rick, and the last child was 5-year-old Greg. Now, James Sharp, the father, was a Navy man, and so this family was constantly being stationed in different areas. While James was doing that, Sue would take care of all of the children. Essentially, she was a stay-at-home mother. Eventually, this family would end up in North Carolina, and soon Sue started to have very heavy thoughts and feelings about leaving James because it was said that he was abusive to Sue. Not only this, but it was said that he began to both of the daughters, but I'm unsure of what the full truth is. Sue decided that she was done with James's behavior and was going to take all of their children and leave him. So she did. I also read here that James had kicked the family out, so I'm not sure. But in April of 1979, Sue and the children left, and she drove to Missouri. This is where her mother-in-law lived. They stayed there for 2 weeks, and then Sue and the children moved out to Quincy, California, to be closer to her brother. At first, Sue decided to rent a mobile home in Quincy, but eventually, by the fall of 1981, she decided to take her family and go a few miles from Quincy to the town of Keddie. Now, Keddie is an incredibly small, unofficial town, and that year had a population of about 67 people. Basically, everyone knew everyone there, and it was hard to come by someone that you didn't know. Sue and the children moved into a cabin, specifically numbered 28, and it cost about $175 a month. To further break this down, I'll show you the layout of the house, as this comes in a bit handy later. For starters, the cabin was 2 stories. And what we're focusing on here is the rear bedroom, which was upstairs. This is where Sue, Sheila, and Tina all slept, and that was their bedroom. Though it was also said that Sue would sleep on the couch, though. The boys' bedroom was specifically for the younger boys, Rick and Greg. You can't see it, but downstairs in the basement was John's bedroom. He was 15, and so he kind of got his own room. It was a basement turned into a room. Now that you have a bit of an understanding of the layout, let me give you an explanation of who each person was and what was currently transpiring. Since the 18 months that Sue had lived in California, she had 3 boyfriends, but nothing ever serious. She was mostly worried about taking care of her children and doing the best that she could. Sue, after moving to cabin 28, began working part-time at a lodge and also received money from social programs and military stipends because of separating from her ex-husband. Though one of the boyfriends that she was in a relationship, I believe in January of 1981, they got into a huge argument, or maybe it wasn't even her boyfriend, but her and some guy got into a huge argument in the trailer. Her oldest son, John, was 15, and it was said that he saw himself, and other people did too, as being a tough kid. It was said that he got into a lot of fights, one happening that same week, and he had a black eye because of it. Though he only ever lost one fight, John was a leader type and in the 8th grade. John also had a best friend named Dana, who I'll talk about here shortly. The second child was a daughter named Sheila Sharp, and she was 14 at the time. Sheila, at the age of 13, got pregnant. I'm not sure who exactly was the father, but there's speculation that it was someone in the Meeks family, a family that was close to Sue and the children after they moved to Quincy. There's a long story there, but essentially Sheila and her mother went to Oregon to deliver the baby girl and give her up for adoption. The baby's name was Melissa, and I'll point this out now just because. Eventually, way later down the line, somehow Melissa tracked down Sheila and they got together again, or maybe it was the other way around. It was also not stated who Sheila gave the baby to or who the family was, or how they were found, if it was just a random adoption or whatnot. But eventually, after delivering the baby, Sheila and her mother went back to Keddie and with her family again. I read that John stayed with someone while his mother was gone. I'm not sure about the other children, but they had to have been somewhere. The youngest daughter's name was Tina, and she was 12 years old. Now, Tina was a very nice girl who unfortunately was taken advantage of by potentially multiple people. One of those people was apparently her teacher, a guy named Joel Lipsy. This teacher was said to have had a photograph of Tina on his desk and another one at his home. He even took this picture of Tina. Not only this, but Joel was a convicted child, and California documents stated he was convicted of lewd or lascivious acts with a child under 14. Even after being convicted, he was still a teacher for several years, which I really don't understand. And apparently Tina was a big teacher's pet to Joel, and he had her sit on his lap sometimes. I have a lot to say about that, but that sums up the majority of the Sharp family. There's no real reason for me to dive into the little brothers. On April 11th of 1981, there was a lot that happened, but we're going to go specifically to the nighttime for the most part. I'll give a brief explanation of the day. Sue did a lot of things for the kids, like taking the younger boys to ball practice in the morning. The kids did so much this day, but Johnny, the oldest, was hanging out with his good buddy, Dana Wingate. Dana was 17 years old and said to be a bit of a troublemaker, that he was a little small for his age and immature, but he was pleasant to be around. Dana was in high school and lived in a foster home. He liked to smoke the good green, and Johnny did it with him. The year prior, in 1980, Dana was placed on probation for slicing $7,000 worth of tires at a place called Nugget Motors. He was just a bit of a misguided kid, but overall a nice one. Him and Johnny both were. In fact, that day, they hitchhiked literally all over town, I believe wearing the same outfit. These two were peas in a pod, bestest of friends, really. Now, way later into the night, eventually these two, after being everywhere, made their way back to cabin 28. Sheila Sharp, the 14-year-old daughter, was spending the night next door in cabin 27, which was the Seabolt family. Sheila was hanging out with either one or both of the daughters that lived there, and Tina was there too. At about 9 p.m., after the show that Tina was watching with the girls finished, she went back home to cabin 28. I also read that Sheila took her back and that Sheila may have been involved in making her go home. I don't know the truth and everything. Eventually, inside of that cabin was Sue Sharp, her son Johnny and his friend Dana, her daughter Tina, and the two youngest boys and their friend Justin Smart. He'll come up again here shortly. Justin was 12 years old at the time. and friends with Ricky, who was either 9 to 10. Now, hours later, sometime what's believed to be in the early morning, something absolutely terrible happened. The exact sequence of events here isn't fully known, but basically Sue Sharp, Johnny Sharp, and Dana Wingate were all murdered inside of this cabin very, very brutally. They were stabbed repeatedly, hit with hammers, and Dana specifically was choked to death. Sue was found with no clothes on from the waist down, and the entire scene was absolutely terrible. Not only this, but Tina, the 12-year-old daughter, wasn't there. She was missing. At about 8 a.m. the next morning, Sheila Sharp, the 14-year-old daughter, went next door to cabin 28 and made that gruesome discovery. The police were called, and now a huge investigation was started. The case would go cold, and a few years would go by, and Tina's skull with a few other bones was found in April of 1984 after an anonymous caller left a tip saying he saw the skull. The caller was apparently out searching for bottle caps or something. But since this case happened, it's been cold. I put that in quotations because of the evidence and unusual nature surrounding this case. There are literally so many theories as to what exactly happened that it's hard for me to even grasp or give you a clear, concise answer. There's so many official suspects, Marty Smart and a guy named Bobo Betty being the biggest ones. However, both of them died years ago. Justin Smart, the boy spending the night at the Sharps that night, was Marty's child. Justin, under hypnosis, told police that he saw Sue with 2 men that night and a whole bunch of other things. He also gave the police features of what the men could have looked like, and the police sketch artists came up with this image. The weird thing is that the sketch artist they used wasn't a professional or qualified artist, and apparently just a good friend of the sheriff's. Marty was one of the Sharps' neighbors, along with his wife, Marilyn. Apparently, Marilyn left him the day these murders took place, but there are so many reasons as to what could have happened and why. Marty also told police that he was missing a hammer, and eventually in 2016, the hammer was found in a pond just up the road. Marty was also very good friends with the sheriff, a guy named Doug Thomas. It's suspected that the sheriff also helped to cover this up. Marty sent a letter to his wife or ex-wife that basically said he took 4 lives, and he told a counselor in May of 1981 that he killed Sue and her daughter, but had nothing to do with the boys. This counselor actually told the DOJ about what Marty said, and for some reason, they dismissed it as hearsay. There's even speculation that Sheila Sharp, the 14-year-old daughter, is somehow responsible and plays a huge role in this, along with so many other people. For this particular case, if you want to learn more, there are forums and other places where people have been researching absolutely everything about it for several years. To me, it seems as if there's a lot of cover-ups and weird things going on. What I do know is that 4 innocent people were murdered on that night, and I genuinely hope that one day some closure can finally come. My last question about this case, though, is how on earth did the 3 boys also in the house not hear anything? There is zero possible way that there wasn't some sort of loud commotion. I refuse to believe that, especially after seeing the crime scene photos and everything else. Neighbors reported that things were very quiet though. One neighbor heard muffled screams at about 1:15 a.m. What an absolute tragedy. The Salon Murders. On November 6th of 2001, 3 women were at the Hair Gallery Salon located in Florence, Montana. Now, Florence is considered to be a CDP, or a census-designated place, and according to census.gov, CDPs basically are communities that are unincorporated, but they're well known and recognized locally. Florence, in the year 2000, had a total of 901 people living there. There were 323 households and 266 total families. So basically, Florence was a very small town where most people knew each other. Neighbors are friendly, and they tend to look out for everyone in their community. That's why what happened on November 6th of 2001 is such a tragedy. The first woman at the hair gallery was named Dorothy Hazel Anderson Harris. She was 62 years old and born on July 11th of 1939 in Harleton, Montana. She attended school there and eventually met a guy named Everett Ed Peary Harris. I don't know how they met, but Ed was born on June 29th of 1933, so he was 6 years older than Dorothy. They would hit it off very well and became best friends, and later they would get married on October 20th of 1955. Dorothy was 16 and Ed was 22, but they were hardworking and wanted to start a family. Dorothy was working as a waitress and cook, while Ed worked on a ranch and on the Milwaukee Railroad. He'd drive heavy machinery for projects around the state. Eventually, these two would have children, 5 in total, and in 1970, they moved themselves and their children to Florence. This was so that way Dorothy could attend Mr. Rich's beauty college, and she did from 1970 to 1971. After she graduated, the family moved back to Harleton, and Dorothy opened up her first beauty salon inside of their home. A few years would go by, and in 1974, the family moved to Missoula, Montana. Together, Dorothy and Ed bought a motel, and Dorothy again opened up a beauty salon. Eventually, she would transform the salon into a craft store, though, because she loved painting, sewing, and creating heirlooms for her family. Dorothy and Ed managed the motel, and a couple of years later, in 1978, they bought a laundromat, also in Missoula. I'm not sure exactly when, but at some point, I believe they sold both the motel and laundromat and decided to move back to Florence. Eventually, they'd buy their final home in 1990. Ed started managing a large sheep and cattle ranch, and Dorothy opened up some businesses. Her first business was called the Wagon Wheel Beauty and Barber Salon. This store would close down, I'm not too sure when, and eventually Dorothy and Ed purchased a building that used to be a post office, and Dorothy turned it into a craft and secondhand store. Later down the line, though, she transformed it into the hair gallery. Dorothy was said to have been a very kind woman who would go out of her way to help anyone. She was friendly and compassionate, and she had an employee that worked for her at the hair gallery, and her name was Brenda Patch, and she was 44 years old and a manicurist at the hair gallery. She was married to a guy named Mike for 23 years. Their anniversary for their 24th was November 7th, which would have only been a day later. Brenda and Mike got along great, and together they had 2 children. Brenda was a very caring and loving person. Her best friend said she was the most awesome lady she ever met. Brenda was very family-oriented, and her husband did everything together. Brenda loved her 2-year-old grandson and constantly would watch him. She was a nice lady who had a lot of friends and family that loved her. Brenda also really loved animals, art, and was considered to be a perfectionist. The last woman inside of the salon was named Cynthia Ann Bush Hoblet Hamby Paulus. Cynthia was 71 years old and married to a man named Jerry. This was her second marriage, and they had been together for over 10 years. Cynthia had 4 children, 3 girls, and 1 boy in her previous marriage. She also had 3 stepdaughters and a stepson who were Jerry's. But Cynthia was an avid outdoorswoman who took on life at every angle she could. She loved spending time with her children, grandchildren, and even 2 great-grandchildren. Cynthia also loved the University of Montana Grizzlies and rarely ever missed any home games. I don't know if she liked basketball or football. Cynthia also loved fishing, horses, and pretty much everyone who knew or met her liked her. She was constantly working in her garden, and typically Cynthia would get her nails done on Fridays. That week, she just so happened to get her nails done on Tuesday. It's believed to be because she was attending a Grizzlies game that night. But on that awful Tuesday, or November 6th of 2001, the day started off normal. Dorothy Harris got to the hair gallery at around 8 a.m. Typically, she would get there around 9. This day was a bit different. A guy named John, who lived across the street from the salon, said he saw Dorothy arriving to the business and then taking out the trash. At some point, Brenda Patch would arrive to the hair gallery to start working for the day, probably around 9 a.m. to 9:45 a.m. Cynthia Paulus, the customer, would arrive shortly before her appointment, which was at 10 a.m. While Brenda got ready to start working on Cynthia's nails, Dorothy went to a bank not too far away. She was seen there at around 10:30 a.m. Dorothy left the bank and returned to the hair gallery at about 10:45 a.m. to 10:50 a.m. In the very short time frame of when Dorothy got back, something absolutely terrible would take place. Another woman had an appointment at 11 a.m. and she arrived there a bit before at about 10:50 a.m. She parked and sat in her car for a few minutes and then noticed a very strange guy coming out of the salon and then leaving in a quick manner. We'll get into him in a moment. But the customer then walked up to the hair gallery as the time was nearing 11, and she walked inside, and immediately things seemed very off. Visibly, she couldn't see much until she walked towards the back door and found Dorothy lying there, dead. Some reports say that she opened the door and then found Dorothy lying there also, but Dorothy was found at the back door, so I'm not too sure. This woman stepped over her body and then called the police. The police would arrive very shortly after, and within minutes, they discovered an even more gruesome crime scene than they ever could have imagined. Both Cynthia and Brenda were also dead, but in the back room. All three women had their throats slashed, and I also read that they had some sort of trauma to their chests and necks. I'm not sure what exactly. The police immediately had thought that this was a robbery, but then they realized that no money was stolen and the women's purses were still there. However, a few of the salon capes were missing. This was a cold-blooded murder for what seemed like zero reason. The customer I talked about a moment ago and a bunch of other witnesses said they saw this guy too, and to give you a brief description of what he looked like, he was about 6 foot tall and in his 20s to 30s. He was wearing a large black duster-style coat and either a large top hat or a fedora. This was corroborated by a ton of different witnesses. One witness even claimed they saw him without the coat, but that makes you wonder, where could it have went? Also, some people believe that the coat he was wearing could have just been one of the salon capes that was stolen. Regardless, the police had zero idea of what they were up against. 3 innocent women were murdered for seemingly no reason. Not only that, but they were very brutally taken from this world in a manner that is typically much more personal. So police looked into all of these women's family members and cleared them. Now in 2001, after this happened, they had suspected this certain guy and interrogated him about the crime, but I guess they cleared him for some time. As the years would go by, this case would go cold. Even after being shown on the TV show America's Most Wanted, nothing came from any of the leads. In the year 2005, that would all change. That man that police talked to in 2001 had been in jail for about a year and a half for a crime he committed in November of 2003. His name is Brian Walter Weber. I also heard it be said as Weber, and in 2005, he was 29 years old. To give a brief description about Brian, he lived in Florence when he was a kid. Eventually, growing up, he'd become a drug dealer or pusher and started to deal a lot of. Not only this, but he was also using it himself, and he was considered to be a violent man. Brian had a girlfriend, and it was said that he vented his anger on her, and she even had a restraining order against him for a bit. Brian, for a portion of his life, lived in California, and then moved to Nampa, Idaho, and got that girlfriend. I believe he may have also lived with his brother. Brian would go back and forth between Montana and Idaho and sell. He was working for a guy who I'll talk about shortly, but Brian was willing to do anything to get his fix, even if that meant beating someone or stealing. Brian and his girlfriend were actually visiting the Missoula area when the Florence Salon Murders happened. I'm not sure what exactly prompted this, but on Thanksgiving Day of 2001, or November 22nd, 16 days after, the police searched Brian's van and questioned him about the murders. Brian said the police got in touch with him and asked if he would be willing to be interviewed. He said yes, and he gave them a sample of his DNA and allowed the police officers to search his van. Brian said the police asked him if there was any reason his DNA would be in that building, and Brian said that he hasn't been in that building since he was just a young boy, back when it was a post office before it became the Salon. Brian said that he used to get mail from there all the time, and he hasn't been there since it became a haircutting place. Brian said he was on meth during this interrogation, but the police never gave him a reason why they interrogated him. Nothing would come from this until 2005, when apparently two separate sources came out with statements to the police about how Brian Weber killed these women. One of the men was an Idaho dealer who was in Montana State Prison, and he told the police that Brian was responsible. Once again, we'll talk about him in a second. The other guy was an informant, though, who told the police it was Brian who killed those women, and Brian said he has zero idea why that guy would say something like that. Now, the police this year told Brian they believe that the guy he was working for sent Brian to collect an unpaid debt by one of his victim's relatives. The police also told Brian that they have concrete evidence that pins him to the murder, and that was a knife with human blood on it. This knife was apparently dug up from Brian's former yard in Nampa, Idaho. Remember this part, as I'll bring it up later. On May 4th of 2005, though, Brian was sentenced to 24 years and 3 months in prison. This was for his case in beating a guy, but 3 years later, in April of 2008, both Brian Weber and a guy named Lincoln Benavides were arraigned and faced 15-count indictments. The charges included murder while engaged in trafficking and the distribution of. A little background about Lincoln is that he spent his childhood in poverty around firearms, growing up in a bad situation. Lincoln Benavides was considered to be the boss of the whole operation. He was 33 years old in 2008, and the police stated that between 1999 to 2001 is when the operation ran. Lincoln was already in prison, serving a 15-year sentence for basically doing the exact same thing the police were accusing him of, aka being the leader of an operation, just in a different area. It was said that Lincoln would provide housing and living expenses to the people that sold for him, and that Brian acted as an enforcer for Lincoln and would do all the dirty work. Lincoln was the one who a few years prior basically stated that Brian was the one who killed the women. He was the informant. In May of 2008, both of the men appeared in court for the Salon Murders. Nothing really happened, as this was just the first appearance. On June 25th of 2009, they appeared in court again and pleaded not guilty. In November of 2009, the charges for murder were dismissed in the case of Lincoln Benavides because he struck an agreement with prosecutors and pled guilty to his charges. In December of 2009, the police dismissed charges that were related to Brian's trafficking because of statute of limitation issues. Brian still had 6 charges though, 3 counts of murder while selling and 3 counts of violent crimes in aid of racketeering. On Monday, January 25th of 2010, all of the charges against Brian Weber that related to the Salon Murders were dismissed. The reason was a lack of evidence and the death of a key witness and the lack of credibility in another witness. The prosecutors said that compromised the case and that Brian's charges were dismissed without prejudice, basically meaning he could be charged at a later date with the same crimes if more evidence is found. Now, to recap, Brian said the police had found a knife buried in his yard. I don't know if that was true, but that would be a huge piece of evidence if it were. Not only this, but Brian was clearly, for some reason, a suspect only 20 days after all of this happened. The police never stated why, but they have their reasonings. And for 2 people to go to the police separately and state that Brian said something about killing these women in the salon is a bit weird. But I genuinely have no idea what happened that day or who murdered these innocent women. I really hope that this case can be solved. and these women and their families can get the justice they deserve. It's very bizarre how this man dressed in a top hat and suit could have moved so swiftly through the area. I read that the police got a bloodhound to trace his scent, and it did, all the way through the woods and to a house. This house was owned by someone who was very old and couldn't really walk well or at all. The trail ended there, and it really makes you wonder what on earth occurred that day. Rest in peace to Dorothy Harris, Brenda Patch, and Cynthia Paulus. The disappearance of the Paperboy. John David Johnny Gosch was born on November 12th of 1969 in West Des Moines, Iowa, to his parents Noreen and John Gosch. Johnny was a 12-year-old boy and the youngest of 3 children. He had an older brother who was in high school and on the football team, and he had an older sister who was in college. Johnny was 5'7" and about 140 pounds. He was very well liked by his friends. He played football. He was a 7th grader, and he was also one of the local newspaper carriers. Johnny became a newspaper carrier on September 27th of 1981 when he was 11. That same year, he won an airplane ride over the Des Moines area in some kind of sales contest. A manager, I believe, at his paper company rode in the airplane with Johnny and said that he's a very nice boy who's well-mannered. Johnny's paper route wasn't too far away from his home, about 5 blocks or so, and he had 37 total customers. It was said that Johnny was a very good employee and a devoted news carrier who always got the paper there on time. Now, this section I'm about to read to you comes from Noreen Gosch, or Johnny's mother's book titled Why Johnny Can't Come Home. Essentially, this entire story starts on September 3rd of 1982. Johnny is 12 years old, and him and his mother and father went to watch Johnny's older brother play football at the high school. While watching the game, Johnny asked to buy some popcorn and then walked to the concession stand. This is when a police officer came up to him and talked to him for a few moments. Johnny's father, then went down to the concession stand and asked Johnny to stand near the field so that way his parents could see him. Johnny did this and stood next to the railing. John went back up to his seat, and this is when the policeman walked back over to Johnny and began to talk to him again. Within a minute or so, Noreen looked down to see her son, and he was gone. John then went down to find Johnny again, and then found him underneath of the bleachers in basically total darkness, talking to this police officer. John somehow got him out of that situation and brought Johnny up to sit with him and Noreen. Once the game was over and the Gosches were making their way out, Johnny had pointed at the policeman and said, "He was really nice. Maybe I should be a policeman when I grow up." Noreen thought that this was very weird of the cop and was confused on what he was trying to do, so she memorized his face. The next day, on September 4th of 1982, the entire Gosch family had dinner together, both parents and all 3 children. They had a great night, and Johnny, at about 9:30 p.m., said he's going to bed because he has a paper route in the morning. After the paper route, the family was going to go to the lake, and Johnny was gonna bring a friend. Johnny asked his parents if he could do his paper route alone the next morning, and John, his father, said, "I guess that would be okay." Noreen chimed in and said, "No, your dad will go with you like always. It is so dark at 6 a.m., and that she doesn't want Johnny on the street alone." Johnny said goodnight to everyone, and as his mom was cleaning up after dinner, he gave her a hug and said that she's the best and he'll always love her. Johnny would then go to bed. The next morning, he would wake up from about 5 to 5:30 a.m., and this part I am confused about. So we just read that Noreen stated that Johnny's father will go with him for his paper route like always, but this day must have been a bit different. Long before Johnny woke up at 1:30 a.m., the Gosch's home phone rang and John, the father, took the call. Noreen said he said, "Yes, all right, yes, all right, okay," and then hung up. When she asked him who it was, he told her it was the wrong number. Noreen thought that this was weird because they were receiving calls similar to this every Sunday morning for the past 4 weeks or so. John never picked up any of those calls until that day. Going back to Johnny, after he woke up, he got dressed, grabbed his dog and red wagon, and went to work. Johnny left his house, walked across his neighbor's yard, and then about 3 blocks to his paper drop to pick up the newspapers. What I'm confused about here is, why was Johnny's father never woken up by Johnny? Johnny's mother, Noreen, said that John always went with him on Sundays, but according to this newspaper from Tuesday, September 7th of 1982, Johnny would typically get help from his father only during inclement weather. Not only this, but at some point, Noreen and John had gotten up out of bed. Noreen claims the phone started ringing again, and this time it was at about 7:45 a.m. One of their neighbors called to say that they didn't receive their Sunday paper yet and asked if Johnny was just running a bit late. So Noreen went to check if Johnny overslept or something, but he wasn't in his bedroom. She then went downstairs and noticed that his wagon was gone. John, the husband, then said, "He is probably running late. I will go help him. Why don't you start breakfast and then we can leave for the lake when we are finished?" Noreen made a very strict statement about John having to go with Johnny on his route. But when they woke up, it doesn't appear as if she was very concerned. They received the phone call from their neighbors at 7:45 a.m. They know that Johnny would start his route at about 6 a.m. Did his parents just let that go? Or you would think that if Noreen was so strict about it, she would send John out there right away to find Johnny. But that's not exactly what happened. This part is also not exactly specified, but it said that Johnny's dog, a miniature dachshund, went back home to the Gosh's home by itself and was found by his father John, and then John went to look for Johnny. I'll dive into the dog here momentarily. But a bit after John went to look out for his son, Noreen said he barged inside of the house and said that Johnny was gone, that his wagon was sitting 2 blocks away full of his newspapers, to call the police. Something has happened. At this point, the Goshes began to get several phone calls from neighbors because their papers weren't delivered yet, and at about 8:30 a.m., Noreen Gosh called the police department. John and a neighbor then went out to deliver the rest of Johnny's newspapers. Noreen said the police took about 45 minutes to get there, even though they only lived 10 minutes away from the station. Noreen then started to call everyone she could to figure out where Johnny was or what happened to him, and she got some very interesting information from a few people. She talked to the other news carriers that were working alongside Johnny, just on different routes. Every carrier told her that they saw a man who was talking to Johnny, that this man was driving a blue car and stopped Johnny to ask for directions. Johnny continued walking to go and pick up his bundle of newspapers, and it was said that he never walked over to the car. This driver then apparently made a U-turn and followed Johnny to a corner where a bunch of the newspaper boys were. A witness, also an attorney named John Rossi or John Rossi, had went to the corner to pick up his newspapers, and he talked to this driver of the blue car. One of the newspaper carriers, a 16-year-old named Mike, said that Johnny said to him, "That guy is weird, that something was wrong with him, and that he's scared and going home." As Johnny began to walk home, his car started their engine and left. Mike said that right before the driver left, he flicked the lights on in his car 3 times. After he did this, Mike said he saw a man walk out between the 2 houses and followed Johnny down the street and around the corner. The 2 were now out of sight. Mike said that he heard Gretchen growl, but nothing else seemed wrong. 2 other witnesses, the Boson brothers, were doing their routes, and this is when they apparently saw Johnny sitting on his wagon slumped over. But these boys needed to get their routes done, and so they were speeding. Every witness within a few moments heard a car door slam, tires start screeching, and the blue car leaving the area very quickly. The car ran a stop sign, and the only thing that was still there was Johnny's wagon. A witness, one of the Paperboys named Chris, said he walked up to Johnny's wagon and assumed that him and some of the other Paperboys went to play baseball or something, but that was not the case. Chris also said that there was no dog there at the time. It was said that the dog had went home, but I'm so confused about how the dog knew how exactly to get home. It's just weird. But Johnny had been killed. And the information you're going to hear shortly is mind-boggling. After the police were called, an investigation was started, and essentially things went cold right away. The police were looking for any leads that they could, talking to all the witnesses, the parents, everything. But they were pretty stumped. Within about a month or so, in October, Johnny's parents refused to take lie detector tests because they thought the police were pointing fingers at them and they have nothing to hide. So, if they had nothing to hide, and I'm not saying that they do, why wouldn't they take polygraph tests? Wouldn't that kind of prove they have nothing to hide? Doing the opposite kind of makes it seem like the opposite. Also, that same time, immediately Noreen and John began blaming cults for taking Johnny. They made tons of posters, appeared on national television, and hired private detectives because they said the police weren't taking the whole thing seriously enough. 2 years after Johnny went missing, another paperboy, just 12 miles away from where Johnny's wagon was found, went missing himself. His name was Eugene Martin, and he was 13 years old. He liked playing video games, football, fishing, and skating. On Sunday, August 12th of 1984, he went to deliver newspapers, and normally he'd go with his older stepbrother, but his stepbrother wasn't there. Eugene was last seen around 5:30 to 6 a.m., and just a bit before that, at 5 to 5:15 a.m., Eugene was spotted talking to a man who was described as clean-cut and around his 30s. This was the last time Eugene was ever seen, and his body was never found. Eugene was taken exactly like Johnny, and was even taken on a Sunday also. I'm gonna dive pretty deep into this in a moment here with some more things about Paperboys and what was happening in Des Moines. However, first I'll talk about what happened from 1990 to 1997. In 1990, a body of a guy named John E. Gosh was found in Mexico, but it wasn't Johnny, just a guy with a very similar name. This same year, a guy named Paul Bonacci was arrested. To make a long story short, him, a woman named Alicia, and a few other people gave videotaped statements to investigators claiming that they were abused by a large ring. There was a credit union called Franklin Credit Union in Omaha, Nebraska that crashed in 1988. And basically there were talks that there was a huge ring involving members of the government and even going all the way to the White House. A very good book about this is titled The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child and betrayal, and it can give you far more in-depth research into all of that. Essentially though, Paul Bonacci was arrested and charged with 3 counts of perjury in 1990 because of this. The investigators claimed everything was just a big old hoax and huge conspiracy, essentially. The next year, in 1991, Paul would come out in July and say something absolutely shocking. But he was also in jail again for, this time, 3 convictions of abusing a minor himself. He was set to be released in October of 1992. But Paul came out and said that he was one of the people who helped abduct Johnny while he was delivering newspapers. Paul said that he helped wrestle Johnny into the car, and then Johnny was taken to a house in Sioux City where someone held him captive. Not only this, but Paul knew exactly what Johnny was wearing. His shirt, his pants. He knew little things about Johnny that basically no one knew, such as Johnny's ankle scar. These were things that were not told to the public. The police and FBI decided not to look into Paul though, because for some reason they deemed him not a credible witness, which makes zero sense. A West Des Moines police lieutenant, Gary Scott, said this exact quote: "We interviewed family members to determine if there was anything that he was saying that was remotely connected to the case, and we just couldn't find anything." What? He literally said a whole bunch of stuff about Johnny, what Johnny was wearing, Johnny's scars, and what happened to him. Not only this, but both John and Noreen Gosh said that what Paul was saying was credible and he seemed legit. So what family members did they interview that said the opposite? But Paul Bonacci was apparently horribly for basically his entire life and sold into these horrible rings. And I guess he started to do the same things himself. Paul goes way further in a video deposition where he talks about MK Ultra and a bunch of other things. It's very heavy stuff. But nothing would really come from this, and in October of 1992, Paul was released from jail, and I believe in 1993, Noreen Gosch and John Gosch separated. Noreen, I read, started to kind of believe her husband John may have had something to do with Johnny's disappearance. Years later, on March 18th of 1997, Noreen Gosch said that she was living in her own apartment when she was sleeping in her bed. All of a sudden, she heard a knock at the door and went to see who it was. She looked through the peephole and saw two guys. Noreen gave this statement first in a sworn testimony at one of Paul's hearings. When Noreen opened the door, Johnny was apparently standing there and said, "It's me, Mom." Noreen said she was shaking and had imagined this moment for a very long time. This year, Johnny would have been 27, and Noreen said she recognized his eyes. The two of them hugged, and Noreen was now convinced this guy was her son. Noreen invited both Johnny and the other guy to come into her apartment's living room. Johnny proved it was him and showed her a birthmark that was on his chest. The guy with Johnny wasn't really saying anything, but sometimes him and Johnny would look at each other. When Noreen asked Johnny where he was living at, Johnny looked at this guy, and the guy told him not to answer that, so Johnny didn't. Johnny told Noreen he found her by watching the Lisa show and knew that he could go to her and she could help him. Eventually, Johnny would leave, and this would be the last time Noreen would ever see him. Now, some people tend to believe that Noreen may have been dreaming, but I really don't know. The last thing I'm going to touch on about this case is this very large fact. It wasn't just Johnny Gosch and Eugene Wade Martin that were taken, or were they the only attempts? In the 1980s, specifically from 1986 to 1989, there were 5 other incidents, 4 in Des Moines in which paper carriers were attacked or chased. This information is sourced from Reddit user West Kendall Jenner, also Noreen Gosch's book, where she also kind of mentions this. Before I talk about it though, there was also another boy named Mark James Warren Allen who was 13 years old and living in Des Moines. Mark was a good child, but he had some behavioral issues. On Wednesday, March 29th of 1986, Nancy, Mark's mother, and her other kids were having pizza when Mark told her he was going to walk down to a friend's house to maybe go see a movie. Mark said to his mother, "Save some pizza, Mom. I'll be hungry when I get home." Nancy watched as Mark would walk down the sidewalk, but afterwards, he completely vanished. Nancy would report Mark missing, but she was told she had to wait 48 hours, and unfortunately nothing would ever come from this. The police were wrong in this situation for making her wait, and the reason for this is because in 1984, a bill called the Johnny Gosch Bill was passed, which basically meant the state legislation would mandate an immediate police response to reports of missing children. That's according to Wikipedia, and in this case, they did not do that. Also, that bill was lobbied for by Noreen Gosch. But still, to this day, Mark is missing. And the newspaper carriers who were attacked first started about 3 to 4 months after Mark went missing. On Sunday, July 10th of 1986, a 15-year-old boy by the name of Jim Polak, who was also a carrier for the Des Moines Register, was delivering papers when a man in a camouflage poncho tried to grab him. Jim wrestled this guy and managed to get away, and he ran home to call the police. This happened only a half a mile away from where Johnny's wagon was found. The second incident was in Indianola, which is a little less than 20 miles away from Des Moines. In September of 1988, a boy aged 10 to 13 was chased down by a man in a white van while delivering newspapers. That's pretty much all the information about that one. There's really not a lot. Not long after that, though, on November 1st of 1988, a 10-year-old by the name of Mike Fackler was delivering papers, also for the Des Moines Register. At around 5 a.m., Mike saw a big man wearing a white jogging suit jump out of his car, and all of a sudden that man began chasing Mike. Mike dropped his carrier bag and ran to a neighbor's home while screaming as loud as he could. The owner ran outside and brought Mike in, and they called the police. The police arrived at about 5:15 a.m. This man apparently looked similar to the guy who tried to grab the boy in Indianola, even down to the same type of vehicle. Mike Fackler lived about 2 or so miles away from where Johnny lived. The next year, on Saturday, July 15th of 1989, an 11-year-old newspaper carrier for the Des Moines Register was out delivering newspapers at 5:15 a.m. The carrier noticed a white van following him, and not only this, but the vehicle was on a one-way street going the wrong way. This man then got out of his car and started to chase the boy, yelling at him and telling him he's going to stab him if he doesn't get in his car. This guy actually managed to get to the boy, but somehow this boy miraculously got away. The last incident happened a few months later on Thursday, September 14th of 1989. This involves an 11-year-old girl by the name of Melissa Gale, who was also a newspaper carrier for the Des Moines Register. She said that a man she doesn't know pulled up next to her in a blue car and demanded she get in the car. Melissa turned around as fast as she could and ran to her father, who was just a few blocks away, also delivering some papers. Now that is where I'm going to end the information for this case, as I feel like it's literally never ending. There is so many twists and turns and weird things involving the disappearance of not only Johnny Gosch, but 2 other boys, Eugene Martin and Mark Allen. All 3 of these boys went missing in essentially the exact same way, all in Des Moines, not far from each other. Also, we can probably imagine that if the same person responsible for taking Johnny and potentially the 2 other boys is also probably responsible for all of the other attempts. It just seems way too unlikely that there would be more than one person, unless multiple people are involved, that would be doing this. What seems very likely is that whoever was responsible for this knew that these children would be delivering newspapers. And not only that, but when they would be delivering them. Perhaps someone that got paper delivered often or even worked for the Des Moines Register was the person who did this, as 2 of the boys who went missing worked there, and so did a bunch of the children who almost got taken. I genuinely don't know what happened here. I wish I did, but I don't. I suggest that you read Noreen Gosch's book about Johnny, watch Paul's deposition, and read a bit more into the case and come to your own conclusion. I personally find everything about this case weird. I find both Noreen and John's reaction to their son missing in the beginning as very strange, and I find a bunch of their behavior to be off. Though how could it possibly be good if their son's missing, and I can't even imagine the feelings that would bring. I also find the guy Paul Bonacci as being a bit unreliable. If he did go through so many years of trauma, it's incredibly understandable though. But he hurt children himself. All I know is that I hope one day all 3 of these boys, Johnny, Eugene, and Mark, and their families, can finally get some closure. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please like and subscribe because it's all we do. I also have an all-exclusive Patreon if you're interested in that. There's a bunch of tiers to choose from, and the 3rd one allows for you to see a Patreon-only video, and that tier and the 2nd one allow you to have your name at the end of each High Time Crime video. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.